Hello everyone, welcome to the Houston Center interview series. My name is Jens Zimmermann, Professor of Theology at Regent College and Director of the Houston Center. Our topic today is cognitive science and personhood. More specifically, we want to discuss how cognitive science can help us define what it means to be a human being and what it means to be a person, and what may be the limitations of cognitive science in doing so. And to help us with this topic, we've invited two internationally known philosophers who've done much important work in the area of cognitive science, phenomenology, and human identity. And to my left here is Professor Thomas Fuchs, who is Carl Jasper's Professor of the Philosophical Foundations of Psychiatry and Psychotherapy at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. Welcome, thank you for being here. And then Evan Thompson, who is Professor of Philosophy here at the University of British Columbia. Thank you, Evan, for being here with us. Well, to help us with this question, what we usually ask our guests first is, where are you speaking from? So, Thomas, let me begin with you. Mm-hmm. You're a practicing psychiatrist. Yeah. You've written much on human identity and phenomenology, philosophical anthropology. Can you tell us just briefly what formed you in coming to that place of talking about these things? Like, are there people that influenced you? Are there books, thinkers that influenced you? What shaped you in the way that you're responding to this now?
Well, mostly you're probably always shaped by persons, and there were two persons in Munich where I did my psychiatric and philosophical training who were particularly influential for me. The one was my psychiatric teacher, Hans Lauter, who already at that time represented an approach to psychiatry which we call anthropological in Germany, which doesn't mean ethnological, but something like philosophical anthropology influencing psychiatry. And he was a well-known representative of that approach, which is of course contrary to the biological approach that gradually took over in German psychiatry. And he had a strong influence on my inclination to see the person in the psychiatric relationship, so the person of the patient in his world, and not just the object of a psychiatric treatment. So that was one influence. The other was by Robert Spähmann, a rather Christian philosopher, which was well known in Germany at that time, who led me to the importance of Aristotelian philosophy, so a kind of nature philosophy that later became very influential for my thought about the human body and its connection to the brain. So interestingly, even from that background, you can later on quite benefit from this Aristotelian approach, which today seems far away, but isn't actually when it's about the interaction between matter and form, so to speak. So these were two influences, but then I moved to phenomenology myself, starting with Merleau-Ponty and also German philosopher Hermann Schmitz, who became influential, and more moved into the phenomenology of the body, of the lived body, and that became my research topic and central research topic until today, embodiment and its various aspects.
Yeah, and so your works like the ecology of the brain and defense of the human come out of that.
Yeah, they are always still flowing from that tradition, from that train of thought.
Yeah. Evan, you're also a prolific philosophical author. You've written important works on cognition, the nature of consciousness. With Blind Spot, you've written a book on, I would say, critique of scientism. But you also wrote a book with the enticing title, Why I'm Not a Buddhist. So I cannot help but ask, how did among other influences, Buddhism bring you to the place of your critique of scientism, of talking about human identity?
Yes, well, there's multiple factors at work there. I I grew up around a number of prominent American Buddhist teachers who were friends of my father. My father was a writer and historian named William Irwin Thompson, and he founded and ran an alternative think tank intentional community in the 1970s, and a lot of very influential Buddhist teachers in the American Buddhist movement were flowed through that. So I was exposed to that kind of interreligious dialogue really from a very young age. And then my first degree was in Asian studies. I studied Chinese language and history and got very interested in Buddhist philosophy at that point. And then when I had decided to go to graduate school in philosophy and I was working in cognitive science, I had an opportunity to work with a neuroscientist named Francisco Varela, who I had met originally through my father. Okay. And he was a very pioneering, influential neuroscientist, theoretical biologist, also one of the leading exponents, you could say, of the embodied cognition movement in cognitive science, also very steeped in phenomenological philosophy, thinkers like Merleau-Ponty and Husserl and others. And when I was a graduate student writing my dissertation, I worked in parallel closely with him, and we out of that work came a book called The Embodied Mind, which was on cognitive science and brought Buddhist philosophy into dialogue with cognitive science to actually articulate a more embodied perspective on cognition. And then I played a organizing, facilitating role academically for many years in an organization called the Mind and Life Institute, which organized dialogues, particularly between the Dalai Lama and Western scientists, also other Buddhist scholars. I was a faculty participant and academic chair of a number of summer institutes that they ran for grad students and postdocs. So I was sort of immersed in the development of Buddhism in particularly in North America and Europe, and became increasingly dissatisfied with how that dialogue was evolving. Okay. And that's what led to the book. Right. And to say in a very short sentence what I was dissatisfied by the way that Buddhism was being presented, as if it was more rational and more empirical than other philosophical religious traditions, and that it wasn't really a religion, it was a therapy or a mind science, an inner mind science. And I thought that this was problematic because it involved a misunderstanding of the nature of religion and how religion and science could talk to each other, and also that it was a misrepresentation of Buddhism, which is, unquestionably, culturally speaking, a very rich religious tradition. So I wrote that book not so much because I wanted to make an argument against Buddhism or to say that somebody shouldn't be a Buddhist. That was not the intention. It was more to explain why I found the phenomenon of Buddhist modernism, as historians call it, problematic, which was the Buddhism that I was always exposed to.
Yeah, that's how, when one reads the book, that's exactly what comes across. But of course, it's a great title to draw you in. I was also, as a theologian, I think the first book I read by you was Mind and Life. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it was in the intro, but I was just electrified by your comment. Well, here's cognitive science wanting to talk about consciousness. Like, why doesn't it consult or even interact with religious traditions who have millennia of experience in talking about consciousness? Right? It's this bifurcation so it's like, yes, here's somebody who wants to engage religious traditions on. And that's a topic I think we'll come back to. So the two issues we want to talk about is cognitive science and personhood, or human identity. So let's start with cognitive science. And I'm going to venture a definition here for our viewers. So cognitive science arose in the 1950s, I would say, and as a multidisciplinary science of the mind, and thus it combines disciplines like anthropology, linguistics, neuroscience, philosophy, and psychology. But when it started, and I remember reading these historical accounts, it really, in the 1956, when the computer came on the scene, like the dominant metaphor for everything became the computer. Mm-hmm. To the extent that even, Dawkins does it in one of his books even later, that even life itself becomes defined in computational terms, right? He says somewhere life is nothing but bytes and bytes and bytes of information. And that is not a metaphor. That is the plain truth, right? And that's become so dominant everywhere in some ways, but particularly in the industry where technology, is backed up with lots of money, where people, talk about life and the human being as a basically biological machine that we can digitize and that we can. So I know both of you have written highly critically about this. And you do this criticism, though, also from within cognitive science, right? So there's a kind of a counter move from within the very cognitive science that has this blind spot, as you call it. Can maybe each of you tell us why you think this computing metaphor is fundamentally wrong, and how you arrived at this criticism? Maybe Evan, we can start with you, and then move to Thomas. Either way.
Fine.
I was going to let Thomas go first since I had just been speaking,
okay,
but
also fine with me, as you like.
Maybe you should go first because I just spoke. So
yeah, go ahead.
Alternate.
Okay, fine. Well, just to start with, I think we can easily point out that the computer metaphor is only one of the many metaphors that we have used in the history of science and biology to describe the functions of the brain, and the metaphor is just the one leading apparatus that we have invented and created in the history. So it was in Descartes' time, it was the organ with the organ pipes that served as the metaphor for the brain, and later on it was the telephone or photography, and all the metaphors are, of course, technical metaphors which were used to somehow describe analogies to the brain. But these metaphors were, of course, all very well restricted in their real scope, and the computer metaphor is restricted as well. For the brain is not a computer. There are too many differences between computer functions and the brain. To start with, the brain has no difference between hardware and software because the brain structure is continuously changing itself in the course of every interaction with the environment. So there is no constant hardware, so to speak, or neuronal basic structure. There is no difference between the functioning of the neural system and the structuring of the neural system. That means in the brain never anything happens twice in the same way. Moreover, there is no data storage in the brain because that would require a constant and fixed structure for data representing. But as we said, there's a constant change in the structure, so you cannot speak of data that are somehow used, but it's rather something like a flexible dispositional activity that the brain provides. And it's flexible in the sense of adaptive to the current situation. So there are no fixed modules that are somehow put in use, but it's an overlap of various areas of the brain who contribute to the current function through their interaction with each other. And that is completely different from how the computer modules work. And then there's often talk about the 0 and 1 function of the neurons. And that is true to a certain extent. They are either firing or not. But that is not a binary code as such, and a pure binary code, because the functioning of the neurons is constantly modulated by neuromodulators like opioids, neuropeptides, monoamines. So all the transmitters that are also important for the emotional functioning of brain and the body. So precisely what we experience as our feelings, as our emotions, is not describable in 0 and 1s because it's constantly overlaid by neuromodulators. And then finally, of course, the brain is not a computer because a computer works more or less by itself with the input and output, but the brain only works within a living body, and that is, of course, the most important difference. The brain cannot fulfill its functions. Even the basic forms of conscious awareness are bound to the constant interaction between the basal and midbrain structures with the whole organism. So creating this basic feeling of being alive, our basic sense of self, is not a function of the cortex, but it's an emergent product of the constant interaction, or one might even say a fusion between brain and the entire body. So also something that you never have in a computer, even if you put it in a robot. It doesn't change anything. So you see the computer metaphor is fundamentally misleading in very basic respect, in very many respects.
But I mean, it lies at the foundation of efforts to, digitize the brain or create a computational, artificial brain. So would you say that's just a pipe dream?
Yeah, you can of course simulate, and here we are of course at a crucial term in current AI discussions and AI development. You can simulate quite a lot of the brain function through computer and through algorithms in a computer or artificial system, but it creates the impression that it is the same output, but it isn't.
Right.
Because it's
just
a formal. It's not a living output. It's just a formal analogy that can be very helpful for science to explore this kind of formal structure that is implemented by the brain. But it's only a simulation. It's not the real thing. As John Searle once put it quite nicely, even if you simulate a thunderstorm in the computer, it will never get you wet.
Okay. Evan, you have leveled very similar criticisms, and I loved your book, The Blind Spot. So maybe can you use that term and explain what you mean by it to explain your sort of critique of this computational metaphor?
Yeah, so the blind spot is the idea that in our scientific worldview, not necessarily in the specific practice of science as a method, but in you could say the metaphysics or philosophical worldview that gets attached to the method, which of course has deep historical roots going back to Galileo and Descartes, the inability to see that lived experience, human lived experience, is the ineliminable source of science. That's the blind spot. Right. So we don't see, when we construct a model and we reify it as how the world is really intrinsically in its inner being out there independent of us, we don't see that our experience is what underpins the model and makes it meaningful. And AI is a perfect example of this because I think you use this word in your writings, there's this kind of like narcissistic loop where we project the human into the machine, and then we read the machine as, with the human projection onto it back into ourselves. So we project onto, say, a deep learning neural network in current AI, the idea that it's really engaging in a conversation, or that it's somehow understanding what it's doing. And then we read that back into ourselves and say, well, the brain is just a particular instance of that kind of, deep learning set of algorithms. But, a deep learning system, a large language model like ChatGPT, for instance, it doesn't know anything about what it's doing. It's a purely virtual system that depends on huge physical energy resource extraction. So the energy budget of ChatGPT is way different from the energy budget of the human brain in relationship to the body. So huge resource extraction with environmental consequences for a virtual system, not a concrete system in the way that the living organism is, that basically engages in very, very high parameter statistical pattern recognition. Or you could say large language models or deep learning neural networks in general are statistical prediction machines, and they are our tools, and they have whatever meaning they have in virtue of our interpretation of them. ChatGPT doesn't know anything about words, doesn't know anything about conversation. Everything that's coded into it is based on pre-labeled data that it's fed and that it spits out in the form of this is the next most likely token according to certain numerical mathematical principles, but it doesn't know anything about words, it doesn't know anything about sentences, doesn't know anything about meaning, doesn't engage in conversation at all. But it feels to us like it does because we've projected onto it in this way where we've completely occluded, this is the blind spot, the whole infrastructure of human experience and science as a human activity that lies behind it. So when people say, like Dawkins does, life is just information or life is just bytes, and that's not a metaphor, I mean, he's absolutely wrong. That is a metaphor, and it's this narcissistic metaphor.
Yes.
And life is very different from any information processing system that we've ever made because it constructs itself physically in such a way that it alters the world in a way that's relevant to its own ongoing existence. And already Kant said in the third critique, the critique of judgment, that there is no machine that organizes itself in this way. Kant is actually the first to use the word, well, in English, how we translate it, self-organization. And he points to a fundamental difference between life as self-organizing, self-producing, and a machine which doesn't do that, because machines are pre-specified in terms of their parts, their interface, their functions, in a way that is radically unlike life. So of course we can use machines as models up to a point. It's not like we can't use the model for certain heuristic purposes, but forgetting that it's a model is the blind spot.
So just to add to say just a little bit more, it will make sense to you. So life is self-organizing, the autopoiesis of life, which you've written about in Mind and Life. So using that self-organizing living principle that constitutes a life, vis-a-vis something dead, stone or something, why cannot there be artificial intelligence? Right? I mean, it's a misnomer then.
Yeah, I think that's right. Machines don't have minds, and living beings are not machines. And artificial intelligence systems are computational machines.
Right.
So you can simulate, as Thomas was saying, you can simulate aspects of the behavior of a living system using a computational model. You can simulate aspects of the behavior of the brain using a computational model. But a model is not the same thing as what's being modeled. The map is not the territory. That's right. So artificial intelligence, in that sense, is not genuine intelligence.
Right. Because for real intelligence, and you can, I mean, there are many definitions of it, but if you say something like orientation within life for self-maintenance, which would go from lower organisms all the way to the human, you need a body to be intelligent.
Absolutely,
right?
that's right.
That would be,
that's right. Yes, okay. you need a body, and artificial intelligence systems are not embodied.
Yeah.
Now, there is the field of robotics, and that has within it individuals who recognize the importance of embodiment and try to work with it in a mechanistic way. And my own view of that is that hits fundamental limitations too, because the materiality with which they're working is not this metabolic, self-creative materiality. And I don't believe you can bypass that to get genuine biological individuality and meaning and selfhood, you could say.
There's an important aspect here which is denoted by the term metabolic. Hans Jonas already pointed out that for the self-maintenance and even for the identity of the organism, it is crucial that it is in constant self-change, so to speak. So metabolism means that the organism continuously reproduces itself through new matter. So through the exchange with the environment, the organism doesn't just stay the same structure, as is the case with every machine and every computer, but it rebuilds itself in its living, in its constant interaction with the environment. It continuously reproduces all the structures, so that literally we are not the same after about 4 or 5 years.
Right.
Every atom has been replaced in our body, and this seems to be something just external to life, but it's not, because that is already that is also what conscious experience is about. Conscious experience is basically the felt need to feel hunger, to feel thirst, to feel pleasure or pain, is about the homeostasis of this constantly self-evolving, self-metabolizing system. So what we feel basically before we start thinking at all is the current state of our metabolic system, whether it's in equilibrium or not, and to prevent it from falling over the edge, so to speak. Life has, so to speak, invented the conscious awareness of the overall state of the organism, which makes us seek for whatever substances, nourishment, that help to maintain the homeostasis. So this shows that the autopoietic self-reproduction of the organism, or metabolism, as Hans Jonas put in the center of his philosophy of life, is also the basis for higher forms of awareness, of even intelligence in the end.
Yeah.
So without metabolism,
exactly.
without this constant self-change, which you find in no machine whatsoever, even not in a robot, the whole phenomenon of consciousness wouldn't make sense.
Yeah.
It's based on that.
Yeah. I just want to say for those watching us here that Jonas's book, I think the English title is Phenomenon of Life.
The Phenomenon of Life,
Principlem, is key. Like when I read any of your writings, Jonas is always right in the background. I think he's really turned things around.
It's very
critique.
important.
So I just recommend for anybody to read that. Just staying with you, Thomas, for a second. You've written much about transhumanism. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but is it something, this transhumanist movement, is it just silly? Are they just completely out of their minds? Or is it even dangerous, do you think? How much attention should one pay to transhumanism?
That's a difficult question. When I started to read and write about it, I always was a bit ambivalent whether it's not just too silly to talk about it. But then overall, I found, or in the course of time, I found it's really it's so important for the zeitgeist, so to speak, of our current age. You have to deal with it. You have to argue with people defending transhumanism, because it's something like the vision of the digital age. It's like what drives people to, apart from money, of course, what drives people to develop all these AI systems, the idea that there could be a kind of separation of the mind from the body. I think that is a deep motivation for many working in this field, or at least, California, Silicon Valley, or wherever.
Absolutely.
So, and then I thought it's very important to go into the discussion and into the argument with transhumanism, and show that it is a deeply, dualistic way of thinking about the human being, and that it is still based on a functionalist idea of the mind being somehow a computer program that could be extracted from the body and then downloaded wherever. And the ideas, of course, are very old, even for the theologian agnostic idea in the end, because that was the idea of Gnosticism in late antiquity, that the soul is something that is only incidentally connected to the body, and it could be purified and somehow separated from the body to reach its real pure form again. And this kind of this kind of religious salvation idea is still working and is behind the motivation of transhumanism to see the mind and to extract the mind as a kind of informational system to reach something like digital immortality, to get rid of the body. As we now argue it's inherently impossible, but that is what drives the motivation to go on with this progress, and therefore it's extremely important to get in philosophical argument and discussion about it.
And it does seem to have a religious quality. Right? I mean,
It has.
It's like a salvation history where you leave the body behind and leave suffering behind and overcome all of this.
Yeah, the idea that you could upload the mind into a computer and attain immortality, that's not a scientific idea, that's a religious idea.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
And I remember reading Irenaeus, and you read it and you think, if you're aware of transhumanism, that's the antidote.
Absolutely,
Like they're just
absolutely.
Gnostics, they're neo-Gnostics.
They are neo-Gnostics, absolutely, yeah.
The other
And
interesting...
Hans Jonas wrote on Gnosticism, that was his first work, by
That's
the way.
right.
Yeah.
Interestingly,
Yeah.
he was very well aware of Gnosticism. Yes.
The other interesting thing too is what we talked about earlier. The metabolistic foundation, autopoiesis, and so on. And what you said, Thomas, about our emotions, how they're grounded in these kind of necessities, biological necessities. Very much part of the discourse of early church fathers like Gregory of Nyssa, for instance, right? That your desires they're coming. I mean, they're taking a negative view of it because you need to discipline these desires, not to get rid of them, but in order to become more Christ-like. But the desires are fundamentally part of what makes us part of the animal world, and we have to humanize them. But there's a recognition that that's part of our embodied existence, right? Which is really interesting. We've left that far behind. And it's this dualism that's the problem, because whether you're Christian or whatever you are, if you fall into that dualism, that's the issue. And
Interesting.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Interestingly, the term you wanted to lead us towards, the term of the person, emerged precisely because of this constant struggle of early Christianity between the dualistic and the kind of in-souled body idea, and it was about the idea of the two natures of Christ, of Jesus, where this struggle kind of condensed or focused on. And it was a fierce struggle because it was a fundamental struggle as we have it today, we could say, between transhumanism and embodiment. It was a struggle about how do we conceive of Christ, because he obviously is a human being. He should have a body, but then he should be a godlike or a son of God, so a spiritual being. How can we reconcile this to be present and to be possible in the same embodied substance, so to speak? And the notion of the person was, of course, one of the major solutions for this problem.
Yeah, for the union of the two natures. And it's interesting if you. That's why I wanted to interact with Evan a bit about, because when we need to move to this, what's the person, is there a difference between the person and the self? But the term comes from, first of all, Trinitarian discussions. Yes. So there's the three, how can they be one? So there's a nature, and then there are these, whatever these are they separate centers of consciousness, or they call them hypostases. And then this hypostasy gets applied to, gets translated by Tertullian, I think, in persona, which is then the person. And that then gets used for the Christological discussions. The person unites the two natures, right? The persona of the Son, the second hypostasis, hypostasizes the body. But it gives you this beautiful incarnational, and they make these this analogy, just as Christ hypostasizes the human body, and or these two natures, the human soul is incarnate in the body, inseparably, without confusion. That's where you... So there's this whole Christian...
That was the formula, inseparably without confusion.
Yeah. So it's kind of comes down to the Christian spectrum, but I know, Evan, you've used and you've analyzed these different discussions, debates within Buddhism, and there the notion is about the self. So maybe I can just get each of you to define for me, if we say the word person, like what do you mean? Is it the same as the self? Is there a difference?
So, I mean, of course, people use these words in different ways depending on the philosophical tradition and the context, but I, in my own thinking, and I follow certain thinkers, like Ricoeur, for example, who maybe would distinguish it this way too. I think of self as having to do with a certain kind of structure of reflexivity, of self-relatedness, which we could talk about structurally in biological terms, or we could talk about it in terms of the nature of consciousness as pre-reflective self-awareness. That's how a phenomenologist would talk about it. Yeah. So self or selfhood for me is something that's enacted through this kind of circular reflexive relatedness of the being or the system, if you will, to itself. in these different ways. Whereas person, I think, refers to a concrete individual situated in a particular place, in space and time, in a particular culture, in a social setting. Okay. So in that way, self is a kind of abstract concept, and person is much more targeting the specific individuality that's incarnate, embodied, culturally and socially situated, and that corresponds in some ways to also to how Buddhists deny there is a self, but.
Well, not so fast.
Right, but I've argued that exactly it's more complicated than that. Yeah. But when they use the word self, they're using it to mean not the person, which they say is the being in the world interacting in a social setting, but to refer to some kind of unchanging essence within the person, which they deny the existence of. But I think that particular way of rendering self is only one way, and this way of thinking about it, which has to do with self-making, is a concept that I use. So just as there is no dance without the dancer, right, and it's mistaken to think there's this thing that is the dance that's separate from the dancer's performance of it, right, so there is no self that's this like essence separate from the selfing process that happens biologically, psychologically, socially, and so on.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's lots to think about there.
Maybe I would completely subscribe to everything that you presented. Maybe just adding to the notion of the person, also thinking about the aspect of relationality seems to be important to me. So personhood cannot be ascribed to a single individual alone, at least according to the Western and especially Christian tradition, but the person is that, of course, minded, conscious being that presents itself to others as a unity of interiority and exteriority. Mm-hmm. So that presents itself as a lived body, which is at the same time the continuous expression of this subjective life of the person. And they now present each other to each other as these embodied unities of interiority and exteriority, so that they can experience each other not just as an external body, but as a lived body, as an embodied person. And at the same time, they are both aware of each other as embodied subjects. Yes. So this relationality is extremely important for the notion of the person. Helmut Plessner, the German philosopher, has once created a suitable term, namely the eccentric position that human beings occupy, because they are at the same time these embodied beings, but they are at the same time able to go out of their center, so to speak, to realize the presence of the other and to see themselves from the other's point of view. Mm-hmm. And this whole bit complicated structure of inside, outside, inside, in relation to the other, is implied in the notion of personhood. So it's unity on the one hand, unity of, psychophysical unity, but it's also a relationality. And with this comes responsibility as well, of course. There is the ethical, door, so to speak, that absolutely opens up, because at the same time, at the very time that you realize that you are the other's other, you're also kind of responsible for him. Just to point out how rich the notion of person then becomes if you include this relationality. But that is a long tradition in Christian thought as well.
It is. Here maybe...
Of course, the primary relation in Christian thought is the relation between the individual person and God himself, so to speak. But that can be secularized as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and that's my question. So I just went through. I just taught Martin Buber's I and Thou, and if, as both of you say, metaphysics matter in how we conceive reality and so on. So for Buber, it's clear that the I Thou requires precisely this. Personal God. Without that personal God, you may have whatever relationality, but it would be more like even perhaps animal sociality, but this particular I-thou requires a personal God to whom we respond. So that's kind of the Judeo-Christian tradition. The Buddhist tradition, can you draw similar things out of it, or do you think there's a limitation?
Well, that's a big, complicated question, actually.
Yeah, but you're the guy.
yeah,
I mean, you've looked at these debates, right? Within Buddhism, it's not that simple. As
I don't speak for Buddhism as a tradition from within, but I can certainly say how things look to me, as somebody who works in intercultural philosophy, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
I think the standard thing that you hear about Buddhism is that Buddhism is not a theistic religion. Sometimes people will use the word atheist, but that's not really right. It's non-theistic religion, right?
Yeah.
And of course, culturally speaking, in all the cultures in which Buddhism has participated over millennia, there's all sorts of conceptions of gods and spirits, and Buddhism has coexisted perfectly fine with those. Yeah. But in Mahayana Buddhism, we have the idea of universal cosmic Buddha figures or universal cosmic Buddhahood, and faith in the Buddha as a cosmic being or deity, not as a individual that happened to exist at a particular historical period in time. And I mean, from my perspective, that functions analogously to the concept of God. Buddhists don't use the word God to describe that, because God for them means like Brahma, which is a particular being, a creator God. And Buddhism doesn't, really think that that's relevant to its religious project, you could say. But the idea of a universal Buddha, cosmic Buddha mind, faith in the salvational power of the Buddha, particularly in, say, a form of Buddhism like Pure Land Buddhism in East Asia, I don't really see a fundamental difference, at least in terms of how that functions within Buddhism, from how the idea of divinity or God functions in a monotheistic tradition, whether it's Jewish, Christian, or Hindu. I mean, for that matter, in Hinduism, the conception of God or the divine in, say, non-dual Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, is very different from the idea of God as a creator being. Yeah. Buddhism rejects the idea of God as a creator being, but as David Bentley Hart points out, that's God as the demiurgos. That's not the God that's fundamentally the idea of God in the monotheistic traditions, which is Godhead or the source or ground of being, which is personified, of course, especially in Christianity, the three persons. But metaphysically speaking, I would think of that as transpersonal, really, because it's Godhead as the source of any manifest reality that we conceptualize through personhood when we want to establish a human relationship to something absolute in that metaphysical sense. So Buddhism has completely analogous concepts philosophically and devotionally, I would say. So this is where again, this Buddhist modernist target that I had in my Why I'm Not a Buddhist book is very misleading, because it presents Buddhism as no God, and you don't need to believe in God, and karma is a principle of cause and effect that's scientific, and all this kind of scientific sanitizing of concepts that are really fundamentally religious concepts, and have value in being religious concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I still wonder, so I don't know how well Buber knew Buddhism, but he interacts with it a little bit in Ayin Thou, and his point remains that whatever God is, it is a being and so on, but this, for him, the Jewish notion, and he doesn't speak about the incarnations, he doesn't speak about the Trinity, but just that the Creator God, who is completely free over against this creation, is unknowable in his essence, to be sure, but he also is an I, so he is the I that, it makes us the thou. It's, his thing is only against an I can you become a you or a thou. And that is the grounds for that particular mystery of interpersonal, that the other is not just, a barrier to my objectivizing him or her because they are infinite or whatever. No, there's this mystery of the person that needs to reveal him or herself.
Gabriel Marcel makes the same argument. In his writings on hope, he makes exactly that argument, that the the absolute thou is God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's just I'm just so when we talk about these religious tradition, how do you think cognitive science, especially within the counter movement to the computational scientific version of it that you both stand for, how can it help us enrich our understanding of what a person is?
You mean
how
the embodied approach to cognition?
Rather than dualistic, right? Embodied. The things that we've talked about.
Well, we have already talked about the one crucial basis of embodied personhood, and that is, of course, homeostasis and metabolism. So the brain is seen as a organ that is responsible and kind of inserted into the constant cycles of vital self-maintenance and sensory motor interaction with the environment, in which the life of the individual living being consists. So the brain can only be regarded as a kind of relational organ, mediating the cycles that go on within the organism and between the organism and the environment. And this would be the twofold, still another dimension, the intersubjective dimension, of course, but this would be at least the twofold basis for an embodied notion of personhood. So there could be no person inside the brain. The brain couldn't create something like a representation of itself or of the body that can be seen as a model or a self-model within the brain and could be called a person. The person is always the whole body in its constant interaction with the environment. That is the basic presupposition for personhood and embodied cognition.
I would say exactly the same thing. I think cognitive science has its own ways of, at its best, of investigating and helping us to understand, I would say, embodiment and intersubjectivity as the crucial dimensions of personhood. And it's very important to pursue that, particularly to counteract this mistaken idea that you're nothing else but your brain, or the self is the brain, which is not a scientifically respectable idea, despite the way it repeats itself throughout our culture. And so cognitive science, I think, is very important to really counteract that and to enrich our understanding of the kinds of beings that we are. And embodiment and intersubjectivity are what come to the fore very much.
And I think for me that's important, because I would say that cognitive science can now tell us that these fun movies where you have a brain transplant, right, and the other person is in the other person, doesn't work. Nor does the transhumanist dream. There are people that again use energy resources to get their brains or heads frozen in cryo chambers in order to be. That doesn't make sense, right? Because you. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. But maybe I can ask each of you to just make sort of a closing statement of why you think that the work that you're doing, this understanding of embodied cognition, and maybe the person is important at this point in our culture. Because we live in interesting times.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we do. We do. But probably every era thinks that. But
yes, that's true as well.
I think we're in a time of great existential challenge. The climate crisis is the most obvious manifestation of that. We have related to the earth in an extractive, objectifying way, and unless we reconceptualize and reorganize our way of living and being on the planet to relate not just to ourselves but to the ecosphere, the biosphere, in this intersubjective, valuational way, then I think we're going to experience a lot of very negative things.
The consequences.
The consequences are going to be negative. So I see it as really a planetary civilizational imperative.
Do you think, Evan, it would help us also? I mean, we live in such a divided society, aside from those things, right? Polarized.
Yeah.
Do you think that a better understanding of our intersubjective, embodied, personhood, if you want to call it that, is helpful there? I mean, you talk about cosmopolitanism, right? In your books,
in my book. No,
vein,
absolutely. I think we have to recognize there are multiple cultural traditions with different perspectives on selfhood and personhood and intersubjectivity, but many of them share this idea of common good that is grounded in our relationship to the world, in our relationship to the cosmos, you could say.
Yeah.
And we have to recover that. We lost sight of that with the tremendous material success of science and technology.
Yeah.
And now we're facing the consequences of that. Yeah.
Thomas, the last word.
Well, I could immediately connect my thought to what Evan said. I think precisely in order to feel and enact our responsibility for the environment, embodiment is really a stronghold and also an obstacle against the idea that everything that we experience can in the end be kind of virtualized because it is only information. And we are really living in a time where a virtualization, a digitalization of ourselves and of others is increasingly taking shape in the form of, artificial intelligence, artificial replica, artificial counterparts that are created as a simulation, and that could create the impression of being our real others, the real persons we interact with, and that would result in a more or less growing disembodiment of our life, and this would mean we wouldn't be really connected with the environment any longer, but with the big data productions of the tech companies that provide these virtual environments for us. So there's a strong seduction to lead a rather comfortable life with all the fancy and all the fancy offerings that create a simulation of the environment that we ever wanted to have, till the loving partner or the sex partner that provides the support and the affection that we want. If we want to really stay in contact with the real environment, then we have to stay aware of our embodiment, of our embodied interactions, and not be seduced into these virtual worlds. Because then we lose the responsibility for the environment that is really in danger.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, well, thank you very much, both, for coming, for talking about this.
Thank you.
And thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.